Welcome to Viva. This is I had an interesting moment last night where I went into the kitchen in the Jesuit residence, and I ran into a Jesuit I'd never met before, Father Krall. So if he says anything crazy, do not stand by any of that. So when we got to talking, and before long, we were talking about neuroscience and the brain. And if ever you thought maybe I was not very intelligent, this interview right here will probably prove it. So okay, tell us a little bit about yourself. What are you? Where are you from? What have you studied? What are you doing now?
I am finishing up I just finished up a PhD at Marquette University, and they actually let me do neuroscience with theology, which is kind of a culmination of a passion that I've had since an early age of the bringing together the sciences with the philosophy. My undergrad was at Boston College, physics philosophy, and as most of you know, probably with the Jesuit formation, it's just you start to take off into a whole world of different educational experiences. But philosophy studies, I was able to do like history and philosophy of science and technology. You went to Oxford in this like science and religion program, the Ian Ramsey Center. And so this idea of the human person through the physical and the metaphysical has always been a passion for me.
Yeah. So when most people say science and religion, I'm immediately thinking something like apologetics, right? Something where like you're out to disprove science, or maybe say in ways in which science and theology don't conflict. But I always feel like that's not all there is to say about science and religion, right? So I think, yeah, go on, please.
Yeah, you're right, because I'm the way I approach it is that it's seeking truth. The old way of looking at theology, it was the queen of the sciences, and so if we can bring the best of the hard sciences, if we say, together with the queen of the sciences, or seeking truth in the way of the study of God, and who is like the unconditional act of understanding. And so that it's like the two can be complementary, or maybe somewhat of a word that comes up. I get into Bernard Lonergan a lot, and so that he uses the word a dialectic, or a tension between the two. But it precisely in that tension does it allow for a fruitfulness of deeper understanding.
Yeah, this is the Catholic model of how you know anything anyway, right? We don't know things in a complete bubble where we sort of look at pure logic. I mean, rationalism is a big mistake as far as the faith is concerned, right? And so I could say the same thing about science and the physical world that we live in. If you treat it as a complete bubble that's discrete from let's say the spiritual sciences, we can call it, or something like that, we have a problem there that is unfortunate for both. Even theology requires that we love our neighbor, and our neighbor is real and tangible next to us in the physical world.
Yes,
is that fair to say?
It is. It is. Yes. Yeah. I guess there needs to be a complementarity, or again, sorry, I'm pulling a lot from Bernard Lonergan.
I love Bernard Lonergan. It's
okay.
Great.
But he has this sense of like the dialectic can either be complementary or contradictory. And it's like, if there's this complementarity, despite the challenges or the tensions there, does it precisely allow for this openness, dialogue's pursuit of deeper truths?
Mm-hmm. And so, okay, so let's get down to what you've studied, I guess, or what you've recently been working on. What's that look like? What does your day look like? I just say, okay, so you're a Jesuit priest.
Yes.
You say your prayers, I'm assuming. You celebrate mass somewhere. You do. I mean, you're an active priest, but at the same time, you may not be running the parish council. You may not be. Tell me what your day looks like.
So sorry, yeah, I'm actually I've just been given a professor teaching position at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska, and they have a big medical school, and they gave me a joint appointment in the theology department as well as the neuroscience department. And so far I've just finished a first semester in teaching a fundamental theology. But they have also developed a course on ultimate questions of neuroscience and theology. And so we'll be diving into things like free will, consciousness, what is human flourishing, ultimately, like, who are we as human persons?
So free will is a big I guess, a big issue for a lot of people, right? So I'm gonna play devil's advocate here. I'm gonna say some things I don't necessarily believe, but you educate me whenever I'll give kind of a popular understanding, right? So, or even somebody who might have read a few articles about about free will, right? So, what if, or how do we know, or what is there to make us believe that free will isn't just an illusion, right? I've read a study somewhere that said you got a guy who he moved his finger and they mapped out his brain waves, and it looked like where he said he thought the thought to move my finger started in my brain, and then my finger followed. But in fact, the timing of it all seemed to be in reverse. What are we supposed to do with that kind of information where it looks like my finger made my brain think, move your finger? What do I do with that?
One of the things that neuroscience is finding is that there is a deep interconnection between the body and the brain. And can we isolate simple understanding the person, consciousness, all these kind of big words, as only residing in one place, as like this, I forget what was Descartes, he was said like the pineal gland was where this is where it is. And so I think the hard sciences, if we can say, has a tendency to be an approach of the reductionistic understanding of it has to be in one location what we're seeking, or that if that kind of a black and white model is like, can we isolate one place, one thing? And so, yeah, does my movement of the finger, does it come from the finger to the brain to the finger, or is there this complex and amazing and beautiful network that's happening between the body, the brain, the soul, dare we say? So this sense of consciousness or an awareness of who we are as a human person is like, and what's controlling that. There's
all right. Don't take this the wrong way, but how, when you're speaking with neuroscientists, or you're speaking with materialists and atheists, which I'm assuming a whole lot of scientists are, how do they not laugh you out of the room when you say that you're interested in questions about the soul and how that plays a part and how you might move your finger? I mean, how does that work today? I think in academia today, how do they handle what you're saying? Is this taken seriously? What do you do there?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I haven't had lots of big debates like with Sam Harris and other great atheists who are pushing this. I mean, I have several books of Sam on my desk and he has this one just come out on free will. And so, I mean, he has this whole kind of gruesome opening line about like these two guys who go into a house and murder this whole family. And it's like, do they know what they're thinking? And is it culpable for what their actions, especially like if you look into their brains after they had died, or you do scans on these two like heinous people, I mean, like these murderers, and it's just like, oh, what if they have these tumors in their, like pushing on a certain part of their brain that is pushing them to do something? Or what if you look in their whole past life and see that they were raised in this very traumatic family, and it's like, and so can they be blamed for that? But I guess the question is like, the very fact that we as human beings are asking these deeper questions about who am I as a human person, what is my deepest desires, and like how do I make the world a better place, does that come from a solely physical?
Certainly before brain science, we were the Catholic theology has taught that culpability is a thing that can be gauged. Based on, without knowing anything about the brain at all, that we would say, did this person steal the bread because they were clearly hungry? We're not asking questions about neurons firing or tumors in the brain or anything like that, or even like the kind of social sciences of, were they raised in some environment where all we did was they said, well, of course, I know what it's like to be hungry. I see someone else who's hungry and they stole bread. So I would think that they are less culpable for what they've done. Now, then it's still wrong to steal, but they are less culpable for what they did because they were hungry. And I know that from my own experiences. So I would say that, I mean, to me, it's so blatantly factual that free will is a thing, because I feel so free. I know what it's like to feel hungry, and I can project that on other people. I know what it's like to feel free. So I assume everybody else feels free to a degree, because I also know what it's like to feel not free, right? So I know what it's like when it's late in the day and I can't help but fall asleep, or, if my hands were bound, I would know I couldn't raise whatever hand I wanted to raise or whatever. But there's this sense of, I also know that I can have thoughts and I can have desires and feelings and not have any physical response that anybody can see. So I can be poker face. I can be very, very hungry, but play the poker face and pretend that I'm not hungry right now. That seems to me to be such a blatantly true thing. Neuroscience is now filling in some of the gaps of what that all means, right?
Sure. Maybe I'll play the devil's advocate.
Okay, all right. Yeah, great.
This is not necessarily what I believe, but is it the sense of, okay, we can feel free, but are there still these pulls? So one of the big challenges these days where people are finding this deep connection to not just the finger, but like our gut brain biome and interconnection. And so there is this proven study about there's this biome within like bacterial within a cat's gut that is like longing to have something that's within a mouse. Mm-hmm. And so it's able to stimulate this particular like scent within urine that will attract the mouse to come toward the cat or near the cat. The cat eats the mouse and the mouse goes to the stomach of the cat and the bacteria is satisfied once it gets that. But so there's this whole interconnection with how the cat urinates. Yeah. And so, but maybe that are we just driven by this gut? And so like that when you're going to the cafeteria or you're going to a restaurant, it's like, I'll avoid that restaurant, but I go to that one. It's like, well, what made you make that decision? Is it your brain, or is it actually like this biome causing this whole stimulation? And we wouldn't know. It's like, it's the matrix and we're stuck in this. And so it's just to be driven by these things.
Yeah. I mean, my response to that, and again, this is going to be obviously because I've not studied the things that you studied, and I might not be smart enough to understand it even if I had, right? But there's this sense of, yeah, sure. I'm not denying lack of freedom. I'm not denying being controlled. There's been lots of times where someone, like let's say, if someone sits here and swats you with a stick, right? You're going to flinch even if they only come close. You're going to flinch, and you're not going to say, I wanted to flinch. You're not going to say, I decided to flinch. You just flinch. And so we certainly know what that kind of instinct feels like, or what it feels like to be influenced greatly by some spirit that is not us, right? We know what that feels like, but that doesn't negate that there's also this other side of a battle inside of us for control, right? So I can to take it to a different place, I can know how to ride a skateboard in my mind, but not physically be able to ride a skateboard because my body doesn't follow all of my commands. I think that's such a universal feeling, but so is freedom. So is I know what it's like to make a decision and to follow through with that decision and to raise either my right hand or my left hand or both hands or neither hand. I know what that's like, right? And so it seems to me at least, we can't negate that. So what's the latest science saying about this? Is it more like, well, we just keep looking for some other free-willed thing
that's true.
to control us, like a gut bacteria or whatever? Do we just keep looking for something else to blame our free will on, or is there something in science that?
I think, you're touching on the idea of intentionality there. Yeah. And so it's like, I intend to lift my right hand or not. And so it's intentionality. What Peter Kreeft, a great philosopher at Boston College, talks about the road to hell is paved by good intentions. Uh-huh. You can have all the intentions that you want. Or St. Paul goes back and talks about it's like, I know what I want to do, but I do not do what I want to do. And this whole sense of wrestling with this like desire to do the good, but continually falling back into the evil or temptation. And so we can have all these good intentions, but then what is our like intentionally acting that out or living that out? And so one of the I've been working with this Benedictine nun, Margaret Funk, and she goes back to this John Cashin. So maybe this isn't the newest technology. This is like the ancient wisdom coming to some of the newer aspects. And I guess that's what that dialectic that we started with. But she talks about the sense of, I think she even was working with another philosopher on this, but the sense of like, if you take a pie chart of sorts of all of our intentionality, and like if we had perfect intentionality and like in total control of our every movement, every action, every thought, and so that would be 100%. But if we take into account like the biblical narratives of who we are and like all the other factors that even our neuroscience is bringing up, let's take out like 50% of that pie chart and say that that's really like primordial sin, the temptations that we can fall to, or original sin that they talk about. So 50% of like our intentionality is already leaning toward kind of a selfishness or a prideful disposition. Another 25% could be caught up into like, and this is obviously generalization, we don't exactly know, but it's like 25% could be caught up into like our cultural upbringing of simply like here we are, like a United States context, and like I want to be a self-made individualistic person that like just I do what I want. And but it's like, is that like that whole mental like disposition kind of driving how we make decisions, how we interact with people, how we have conversations? And then maybe another 15% of even that last remaining quarter is divided up into like how I personally grew up in my household. It's like, was it a very traumatic household, or that is like that, like, and I always had to fight against a lot of brothers and sisters, and I just had to go for my one piece of small bread that I'm going to get at the end of a meal, and like, but I just have to fight for everything. And is that going to be how I grow up and how I interact with all my other relationships and how I live my life and the job? And so that leaves like 10% of like when it comes to everyday decisions, it's like, is that what's controlling us? And so maybe again, another book is like this, it's called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, of like that, like these traumatic experiences are woven within the very fibers of our physical body, because it's like, but it's like we're carrying all this with us in everything we do and all the decisions we make, and the preferences, the little subtle preferences that we are leaning toward subconsciously many times, but that we have like these subtle things of like, I'd rather do this than this. I'd rather take this, or it's like, I intend to do this, but where do those initial decisions or the desires stem from?
What are the challenges to answering this question when it comes to science? My understanding is that maybe the most popular understanding is that we can reduce everything down to sort of mechanical interactions, right? Yes. You've got neurons that are connected and whatnot. Seems like that's not really the best science, though. The best science says we have some mysterious things happening. Can you describe some of those mysterious things happening?
Well, one of the areas that I was looking at was the interconnections of the synapses themselves. And I mean, we talk about, neuroscience talks about the number of like billions of synapses, if not up to trillions. And there's this whole somewhat like weeding out process as we're growing. But the actual interconnection between when one neuron meets a second neuron, and these two have this gap in between them, known as the synapse. And then there's these like neurotransmitters that like are chemical or hormones, things like dopamine. Everybody wants to get their dopamine hit and things, but it's precisely those chemicals that are jumping across this gap that then start a second communication down this second neuron. And then it passes across like to other neurons or out to the body, and like how the body communicates, how the brain communicates, how signals are sent through this, like an electrical impulse shoots through, hits the end of this like presynaptic cleft, causing these chemicals to go across, and then it hits the second, causing another electrical. So it goes from electrical to chemical to electrical, and to have this communication. In some ways, it seems very inefficient of how that communicates, but it can happen like in fractions of a second. So like we're very efficient at doing that, but it's like, still, wouldn't it be better just to have electrical impulses going straight across and not having this gap with these chemicals that can have all sorts of confusion? But precisely in that gap, it allows for such variation or possibilities. Now, this can also lead to anxiety or depression. It's precisely in those things that when these chemicals get caught within the gap, that it causes confusion, or that if there's not the right uptake into the second neuron, then there's this sense of that the chemicals are still there. And that leads to us having this kind of anxiety or depression or sadness or elation if there's too much, and we have this like mixed emotions of sorts. But it comes down to these small little gaps within these neurons. And so, but the question is, why there's not just electricity going all the way through is like, does it allow for the variation and the beauty of like making decisions and the possibility of life, or that we have all these different ideas to like do different things, or this spectrum of decisions that I could make right now of like, running out into the streets or staying here and talking randomly about these deep thoughts. But it's like, but that we have this like, no, this intentionality to make a decision to do something that we want to do. And is that coming down to these small interactions, but then it's like the symphony that's happening across the entire brain simultaneously. Well, the question is, well, what's driving that transmission from one to the next? But it's like, is it simply these neurotransmitters just jumping across, or is there a guiding force? And what is that force that's leading that? And is it material or is it a non-material? And is that where will or desire somehow meets the physical?
Is that the ether? Is that the ether?
True.
Right?
So that's the challenge. Because at this point, neuroscience can't really answer that question. There's all these like different like gating. They call it the EATs, these long word, but like this amino acid electricity kind of like gatekeepers at both sides of the synapses, and how those are arranged and where those are arranged, and what neurotransmitters are allowed through those or not, are all these questions that I know. I was just working with this fellow PhD student at Marquette, and like his whole PhD dissertation is going to be on these little gatekeepers within the synapse that do some uptake but not others, and block others or open others. And it's like, what causes that? And they don't know. I mean, right. There's like if it comes out of these small things.
Yeah, it's amazing to me, right? Apart from being incredibly nerdy, it's amazing. it's amazing to me. It amazes me that we can get down to. I say we as if it's somebody like me doing this, but it's amazing to me that mankind can get down to studying these things and still find ourselves asking the same questions that Thomas Aquinas, his whole, one of at least the proofs for the existence of God is one of like, hey, you can't keep kicking the can down the road and saying, well, now we figured out it's just the gatekeepers. Well, the gatekeepers, do they have a mind of their own? You know, what are they doing? How are they governed? And what's, so the governance of all these things ultimately is going to lead you back to bigger and bigger questions that it makes me wonder if the most accurate, full, helpful way to look at these things are some of the most ancient, concurrent with the science, right? And I don't want to take the science and say it's not helpful, because I think it's incredibly helpful, especially when it comes to repairing physical problems in the brain or in the body and the whatever. But that there's this other spiritual side that just as soon as we say there cannot be a spiritual side, it leaves us with giant blaring questions that don't seem to have an answer even on the way. It just seems like we keep finding there's more and more and more mystery that and it's the same kind of mystery that can't be solved until we at some point say there's an immaterial world that we have to consider when we answer these questions. Now, again, I
and I guess in some ways that's where more my expertise is the idea of looking at what makes us a flourishing human person. And that and to preserve, classic Jesuit phrase, the cura personalis, or to preserve the wholeness of who we are. And that what actions can we intentionally do, even if it is that 10% of little actions that we can control in our lives or that we bring, but that by doing things like, or actions like prayer, or spending some time in reflection and who we are, or what our deepest desires is. Ignatius is always asking, like, what is your deepest desire? And like, what are you longing for? Right. So that if we have these intentional actions, and so looking back to these ancient practices for even from the Judeo-Christian understanding of taking time for prayer, acknowledging who we are in the presence that we are not the creator and there is a creator that creates us, but that are there these guiding forces. And so, but what interesting aspects, but when we do pray and we go into these and are able to come back to our breath, simply even like mindfulness techniques too, it's like that, the way the human person has come to a sense of calm or strengthening of like these mindfulness to Buddhist meditation practices. But let's not forget about the deep contemplative aspect of Christianity that goes way back to like these desert tradition of sorts. And so when we do these things, and now that we have the neuroscience to kind of back it up or look at what's happening when we do these things that have been passed on from generation for thousands of years, it's like that coming to a sense of focus, prayer, breath, that we can start regulating a sense of self-regulation, like the beating of our heart, the blood pressure that it has, or even sense of like regulating the signaling or the activity of
Mm-hmm.
the electrical impulses in our brain. That is like that we can start to have this mind control of
Mm-hmm.
seemingly these autonomic systems, but know that this is this integration between the mind, body, and
Yeah.
soul.
Yeah. And we you know, I find at least that it's easy to get enamored with the way that some foreign culture does something that sounds so mysterious to me. It's like it's all packaged in something that seems almost more, maybe it at least seems more spiritual, right? In some kind of way. Like I think of these Buddhist monks and I think, man, isn't it wild? These guys put on these saffron robes and they go into their Buddhist monastery and somebody's lightly banging a gong, you know, and they're all, you know, and I imagine that's what it's like. But in fact, well, number one, that's not really very accurate. I was reading the news; they had an entire Buddhist monastery test positive for methamphetamines or something. So, like, you know, these guys sin as well, right? They struggle. They go. The human struggle is real for those guys as well. But then also to say that I believe that within the Christian tradition there are all of these goods too, plus a right understanding of God that ultimately makes that stuff more fruitful. So rather than just saying I'm experiencing happiness or a sense of peace, I've regulated my breathing, I've removed the anxiety, I've maybe even come to realize, you know, that I don't hold the wrong things as so important in my life. But at some point, if you go all the way with some of these things, it's to deny reality, right? To say the reality is all just one big illusion. And within what we're saying, no, it's worth studying reality. It's worth looking at the brain. It's worth checking these things out because we believe reality is a real thing. We believe that it's not just an illusion. There's some qualities about reality that we believe are, you know, can fool you, but certainly the real world matters to us in the Christian faith, right?
I hope so.
Which is why there aren't a ton of scientists coming out of Buddhist monasteries, but there are Jesuit scientists. There are Jesuit scholars who take the time to study this.
And I guess in my dissertation, I went back to like the phrase that Vatican II used, like a ressourcement and an aggiornamento. So that we have to look back to the deepest sources of our Christian understanding, but then with a fresh look, and then with the dialogue of the modern world. And I guess, again, another phrase that Lonergan uses is like to become, or he has considered himself as a critical realist, in that is that we can live in the world and experience this world, but we're driven to this pure desire to know, to dive deeper into, is this to make an understanding about this world, and then not just an understanding, but we want a true understanding. And so that it's like we make a judgment: is this so or is this not so? And then from that judgment, and hopefully coming to a truth, we can make a intentional decision about that. And so it's taking the best of what we have, and what is the best of the Christian tradition. And I think that we cannot forget about our deep contemplative aspect, but how does that get integrated into our everyday liturgies and the masses and the sacraments? And so it's like when I intentionally go to confession, it's going against everything I want to go against. My body's saying, don't go admit your faults. Don't go say
sweaty palms, dry throat,
but by doing this, is it precisely, and like, could it do the whole neuroscience of the sacrament of confession, like naming these things that I want to keep hidden or forget about or like let go. But it's like by this admission of who we are, what we're about, in our worst, does it allow for then the best? So St. Paul again, it's like when I am weak, it is precisely that I have this greater strength. And it's like that's against survival of the fittest, but it's like that sense of so the deepest lessons of our Christianity, it's like a humility will actually bring us to a deeper strength.
That's fantastic stuff. That really, really is. I was speaking with Father David Paternostro a few days ago. I guess it was over the Thanksgiving break, and he's studying St. Thomas Aquinas and writing on St. Thomas Aquinas and the problem of evil, which is it's certainly a very old problem, and it's been around for a long time. And it struck me some of the things he was talking about, that maybe academia is ahead of the game in a lot of ways of what you'll find sort of the common, Joe Rogan podcast or internet Reddit, forum, not to, those lots of smart people in those places. But it seems to me that a lot of the most popular trends that you would maybe think of call them intellectual trends amongst just regular people. It seems to me that sort of an analytic, purely logical discussion is what everybody's trying to aim at. And then come to find out, you've actually got these scholars, these real guys who are getting real jobs in real universities and all this kind of stuff, that are willing to talk about things like the soul and evil and things that at least for a while there, I think maybe modernism try to close the door on and say, look, we don't believe in these things anymore. That's like believing in Santa Claus. That's like believing in whatever. We're going to take all those kind of categories of things and just completely put them out. And we're either going to be purely, pure rational logic, or pure scientific, experimental. If we can't show it and touch it and feel it and smell it, it doesn't exist, kind of thing. Materialist atheism, that those are it felt like, at least for a while there, that was the most common trend within academia, or it felt like that. I don't know, but certainly people are acting like that now. When it seems like maybe academia has taken a step forward and said, not so fast, right? Not so fast. There's a lot more to know about this. Is that your experience in the world, in the conferences you go to, the scientists you dialogue with, those kind of things?
I think it's important, and I guess in some of the conferences and things, like, I mean, if we're actually talking about what do we mean by science, and what is the work of science, and it seems that if you actually go into a lab and see what a scientist is doing, they're taking a very good look at the real, at this world, and like through microscopes to telescopes to scanning images of the brain, like all these, like the way technology is advancing, but it's trying to use some of our five senses and the enhancements that we have developed to enhance these five senses, and looking at some very small piece of a cell, a neuron, a distant galaxy, a piece of bacteria from the gut, and like do this whole analysis of it. But it can be a sense of like you're taking a small look at the very real, and then you're abstracting it by putting these little measurements or different formula into spreadsheets, and these spreadsheets then can be taken into like these differential equations and different formulas, and then you're making hypotheses about like predictions of how these things will act in the future. So it's like taking what the good work of science is, kind of reducing things down to like this small thing, scanning it, measuring it, doing all the different analysis of it, but then it's like an abstraction of the real out into theories, postulates, going to conferences and writing these kind of abstract articles about what you've done. But it's like it's going from the real to the abstract. Now let's look at like what is the role of religion or theology. Well, it's starting at this like abstract, the most abstract, like there's this God out there who created everything, and he's the source and the unconditional act of everything. But then it's like what the work of religion and theology is like, how does it apply to my life? I mean, I struggle to relate to this other person, or my weaknesses or my faults and failings, or to take it to the sacraments. It's like just going from the abstract completely and saying like, but into the mass, it's like this small piece of bread, this is God. And it's like in the very concrete, the very particular.
And there's even been a transmutation there. There's even been a change. It's not only is this guy, but it wasn't a few minutes ago.
That's right.
Right. So
and
something
it enters
changed.
into the very reality of his present moment.
Right,
so it goes from. Yeah. So I mean, the two are again not contradictory but complementary. By science going from the concrete, specific, individualistic, then very particular to the abstract. But theology going from the abstract but bringing it into the concrete and the particular.
Yeah. And
so it's like, and that's where I find it exciting. And then should the two, and it's like where that meets, that particularity, the stuff of life, the sucking the bone marrow of life itself. It's like carpe diem, but it's like that particularity. That's what life is. But is that truth then too? And can the two then mutually inform the others?
Okay. I love it. Listen, I love it. I've got a couple of I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but to ask you a couple of kind of like pointed questions. Number one, if I was a sort of science-oriented young man or woman, and I believe in God, but I feel the whole religious thing kind of slipping away, who's a good saint that I could turn to, or a good author that I could read that would maybe help save some of these propositions that I want to hold and that I think that I should, but
Great question. And I think the saints are important people to go to, and wonderful people. It's like these emphasis of the divine in these particular areas in their lives. One of the in my class, I just finished a kind of a fundamental theology class, but obviously I'm naturally weaving in some of these things. Is I mentioned this Margaret Funk, but she went back and was doing a resource mont of this John Cashin. But in a common day, it's like one of the things we're wrestling with is like and fascinated by is the psychology, neuroscience. But she has this book called Thoughts Matter, and is going back to the desert and to John Cashin traditions, like synthesizing it and getting into a very concrete book and applying it to this present situation. Mm-hmm. But thoughts matter, and I think, and she a resource mont of the faith, but then applying it. Too often we can get so caught up in the stresses of life, the anxiety that we have, or all the different thoughts or the distractions. This isn't an old problem, and they're a new problem. It's like this desert tradition of these monks and nuns who went out into these huts in Egypt. It's like they too are wrestling with these, like, I'm always just hit with this thought that I like a sense of dejection. It's like I start shooting on myself all the time. It's like something we do all the time. It's like
shooting on myself.
I should have done this. I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody instead of a bum. And we can keep talking ourselves into this, but that's like dejection is one of these key thoughts. But her fundamental line is, we have thoughts. Thoughts matter. The name of the book, but I am not my thoughts. Well, then who am I then? And so then she helps kind of walk through that. And so she has this. So I mean, that's definitely one. It's like I've used and have recommended to a lot of people. Yeah. And like bringing up this like Saint John Cashin and this whole desert tradition of kind of who we are. So I mean, that's like kind of specific on like the neuroscience aspect of things. And, hey, I mean, I'm a Jordan Peterson. I'm a Bishop Barron guy. I mean, and so it's like he's talking even specifically. Young men dealing with their identity. I think that's like Jordan Peterson, like he's trying to reach out to them. It's like it's interesting how he's having these somewhat conversions himself.
Yeah, it is interesting to watch his dialogues between himself, Bishop Barron, and Jonathan Pageau are some of my favorite conversations to watch. I just feel like I'm watching these guys really come at it from very different directions, but at the same time clearly seeking something real and something true. That is so, I find even the seeking can become so satisfying, while at the same time pulling me forward. It's the seeking itself feels is a balm to my soul. One of the people I always recommend as well. He's not a saint, but I say just read a little bit about the life of Athanasius Kircher, the Jesuit, because his life is so wild and the things he studied. He's so curious about the world. And yet here he is, a Jesuit priest, doing his thing as a Jesuit priest. That I find, if you can hold those two things, if that man, who was clearly very intelligent, can hold those things together, and there wasn't anything in the world that didn't interest him in the world, so, well, very good.
Even in this Advent time, there's a good friend of mine, Peter Nguyen, who he did his dissertation on Alfred Delp. And I mean, just a Jesuit priest in Munich, while the Germans were coming to play, and he did die in a concentration camp. But he has this wonderful book called The Advent of the Heart. Yeah. And in this Advent time, as we're preparing for the coming of the Lord, do we need that all the more now? It's like, how do we prepare our heart, open our mind, become these receptive agents to the love of God that's drawing us into this? Right. So I guess intentionality, if we had talked a lot about that, can that be a sense of becoming ever more receptive? And it's like a receptivity to, and like we can choose to do that, or we can choose to become ever more closed-minded or hard-hearted and prevent that from happening.
Is there a project that you're working on, or something you'd like to plug? A book that maybe or an article or something like that you'd like to point people towards?
I guess my book's on the way. I guess I'm still working on a sense of it's going to be on like the neuroscience of prayer is kind of a working title, or this is coming, but it's like that's still in the works and coming. I'm kind of doing a lot of editing. I did just have an article come out in the Journal of Moral Theology looking at the importance of there's a lot of work called social neuroscience, and who are we as human persons, who are we flourishing, but people in relationship, and just looking at some of the issues that came up in terms of the quarantine, the pandemic, and how what was actually the worst aspect of the pandemic? Was this physical virus,
Mhm.
or was it the effects that this virus made us do of like this isolation and then caused like this depression, anxiety?
You're gonna get us banned on YouTube. Be careful.
But I mean, regardless,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I mean, all of these political things.
Sure.
But it's simply the idea that, like, I mean, simply looking at the facts, and they're not trying to like point any fingers, but it's simply like what we as people desire is to be in community, and
Yeah.
when that's prevented,
Absolutely.
or like that somehow that we find ourselves, and we can make that choice ourselves again to isolate ourselves, was isolation, division, the very result of sin in itself. And so it's like, and then it has this whole consequence of like it pulling our whole self down. And so the idea of we preserving the idea of the fullness of who we are by precisely being in a relationship. So,
I cannot wait to read that. I'm going to dive right in. Look, I'm so glad I met you. I'm so glad that you spent some time with us here on YouTube, and I greatly appreciate it. Christopher Krall at Creighton University. Everybody say a prayer for this guy.
Hey,
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'll end the stream up over here.
Okay.